This morning, I would like us to think about burdens. We all have burdens. We see a lot of people going through a lot of different things in life. And sadly, there are just some of these things, some of these burdens that we have to bear ourselves. We can't ask or have someone else take them from us, even if they wanted to or could. There's some things that we just have to do on our own. Many times throughout my life, I can remember different things that I went through. Through my teeth, I was a professional dental patient through my young life. Not only did I cost my dad a lot of money, but I was in a lot of pain because of that. And many times I remember them saying, my mom and dad saying, I wish we could go through this for you, or I wish we could take that away from you. If you've ever had to go through braces or anything like that, you're in pain a lot. About the time that your teeth get shifted and adjusted to where the last adjustment was and you can eat again, it's time to go back to the orthodontist, and they crank those things down tighter and your teeth are sore again. But that was something, they couldn't go through that for me. And not that I would have wanted them to, but it just wasn't possible for that to happen. And there are burdens in this life that each of us, similar to that, have to bear. If we look at the two statements from Galatians chapter 6 and verse 2 and Galatians chapter 6 and verse 5 made by Paul, and compare those two verses together, the words and meanings there, when it comes to the word that is rendered as burdens in especially the King James Version, those can be task and the things that we must do in life. Some would say, well, those two verses contradict themselves. But when we look at them and when we look at the other scriptures around that subject, we will see that there are no contradictions in them. And as always, there is harmony within the scriptures. Galatians chapter 6 and verse 2 says, bear one another's burdens and so fulfill the law of Christ. And then in verse 5, it says, for each one shall bear his own load. Now again, in the King James Version, both of those words are translated as burdens. Verse 2 says to bear one another's burdens. And then immediately verse 5 says we have to bear our own burdens. These two are not contradicting statements, though. And while some harp on verse 2 in our society, that we're supposed to do everything for everyone, and it seems to be a kind of a socialist mentality, we're going to take care of everybody because we shouldn't have to do anything for ourselves. But verse 5 would contradict that mentality, because it shows that there are things that I have to do for myself. There are things that I have to carry on my own. And when we break those two verses down, in fact, we would see that the burden that is talking about in verse 2 is a weight so heavy that I cannot possibly lift it on my own. In verse 5, however, that word symbolizes something that is much smaller and manageable in weight. Verse 2 would be a boulder, a huge rock. At my grandpa's house, in his backyard, and it was in the mountains of Kentucky, there was a rock that, but on one side of it, it was the backstop for the basketball court, because it was so high that even at 10 foot, the basketball goal was beneath it. And we were always yelled at as kids when we would get up there and play on that rock, because our moms were afraid we'd fall off the edge of it on the other end. And it was a long way down. That was a huge rock. There is none of us that would be able to come and pick that thing up and move it. It was going to be there for a very long time unless someone with heavy equipment or dynamite or something like that came in and removed it. Now, verse 5, however, is not like that rock, but it's like a book bag or a satchel or something that we would carry something in. So what is verse 5 telling us when we compare these two verses? Well, verse 5 is telling us that there are going to be things in life that we must do for ourselves, things that we must go through ourselves, and that no one else can do those for us. And what could be part 2 or maybe even 3 of this lesson, I'm not sure how far we're going to get with it today, but when we look at the points that we look at this morning and things that we have to do on our own and bear on our own from verse 5, later in this lesson, we're going to look at how we can also help others, going back to verse 2. The things that we do have to bear on our own, there are still ways that we help one another and fulfill that law of Christ and help each other overcome those things. So hopefully in the next week or week and a half, we'll be looking at that. And this study is meant to encourage each other, to encourage ourselves, because there are things that we do have to go through in this life that will discourage us and bring us down and cause us pain. And as Christians, we need to continually work to build ourselves and one another up. The Christian life, however, has never been promised a ticket to Easy Street. Obey God, and all of your earthly problems will be solved. That's all you have to do. There will be no more pain. There will be no more sorrows. There will be no more worry. Everything will be taken care of. But that is not what God has promised us. Yes, there will come a day when all those things will be not even a memory, because we will have no memory of them, but those things will be taken away. But while we're on this earth, God has never alluded to that being the reward for a Christian life. If that were the case, then our motive for obeying the gospel would be wrong. If we obey for a promise of an easy life, then we're not obeying from the heart. We're obeying because we have been promised an easy life. That's not what the scriptures would teach us. In fact, they would teach us the opposite. Jesus talks about taking our daily burdens of this life in Luke chapter 9 and verse 23. It's a task that we do daily. Deny myself every day. That's difficult all by itself, isn't it? Luke chapter 9 and verse 23. Then he said to them all, if anyone desires to come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross daily and follow me. Do this every single day. This is a task that I'm going to be doing from the day that I call on him and obey him. And he will be my Lord. I will deny myself, my sinful desires. I will take up that cross. What does that mean when we hear that saying, take up your cross? Well, if we go back to the time of the crucifixion, we've seen a lot of that in the last few days, this being the Easter Sunday that all of the Christian world recognizes as the day of the Lord's resurrection. I guess we had some confusion in our business meeting as well. I thought Tom was going to wear his bunny costume. And then when I came in, they were asking me where mine was. So we just don't have anybody wearing a bunny costume today. But seriously, when we think about this, take up my cross, what does that mean? Well, back to the time when Jesus was crucified, that was part of the sentence that he was given. Not only did he know that he was going to be put to death on this cross that he was going to be hung on, he had to carry it to the place of execution. Of course, we know that Jesus was beaten to the point and to the state physically that he could not finish that task. What a horrible way. We, in our world, worry too much about, on the other side of the coin, about keeping everything humane. How inhumane is this? Not only have you been sentenced to die, and you've been sentenced to die a cruel death, but you have to carry the method of the way that they're going to kill you to the point of where you're going to be killed on it. That was the suffering that the condemned had been given. You're going to bring the means of your death with you. And that's what Jesus is saying. From a spiritual standpoint, we have put the old man of sin to death, and we're going to carry that cross with us. And we're going to carry it every day. I remember a few years ago, I don't remember what state it was in, but there was an inmate that had been sentenced to death. And on the day of his execution, somehow he took a bunch of pills and tried to commit suicide. Now, in the wisdom of our government, they revived him just to prolong his execution and put him to death later. Now, we talk about in the times of Christ, he had to carry the means of his death to the point of where he was going to be executed. In our world, we revive them once they try to, why they just didn't finish the lethal injection and kill him while he was already asleep is beyond me. But that's how our world is versus how it was in the time of Christ when he said, you're going to take up this cross daily. And if we're going to follow him, we're going to be willing to carry that cross every single day. Whatever it may be, it could be temptations. It could be trials. It could be struggles. It could be aches and pains. Whatever we have in this world, we're going to pick that up and we're going to carry it with us and we're going to follow Christ. There are no promises made, again, to the Christian that tells us once we obey the gospel that we're going to escape these earthly problems while we're on earth. We're not exempt. We have the same struggles with life that we did before we obeyed the gospel. We've not found some magic potion to alter the downturns of life. If there were, and if that was the case, then we would have this building full. The parking lot would be overflowing. There would be people lined up out the door to get in because of the immediate physical benefits. But Paul tells us that we're going to bear burdens. In 2 Corinthians chapter 5 and in verse 4, the reason that is the case is because the body that we're in, this tent, is not meant to last eternally. Nothing on this earth is meant to last eternally. 2 Corinthians chapter 5 and verse 4, for we who are in this tent groan, being burdened, not because we want to be unclothed, but further clothed, that mortality might be swallowed up by life. If we go back to verse 1 in chapter 5 there, Paul is talking about this tabernacle, this temporary housing of our body. And he calls it the earthly tent, a movable dwelling place. If we have ever camped or been around a tent, we know that they're not going to last like a house would on this earth. They're not permanent. Nothing compares on this earth to our eternal spirit. It's going to live eternally in our heavenly home. When I was reading this verse about our tent and our body being a tent, I thought back a few years ago in 2023, in the spring of 2023, we bought a canvas pergola. Now you can find them at Walmart or Lowe's, and several people have them around. You can see them in their backyards, and you set them up, and they have a relatively flimsy metal frame that holds them. And if you're lucky, if you're really lucky, you might get a year out of that tent. Well, we got 2 years out of that pergola. But you know what happened? The second that we put it up and it started getting rained on, the canvas started getting a little more brittle, and the sun dried it out. And when we had that big snow, I believe it was in January, guess what happened? I woke up on Sunday morning and I went out and looked at it, and the roof wasn't there. The roof was on top of our hot tub because that heavy snow collapsed it. It was not, that pergola was never designed to last forever. It was not designed to hold up 14 inches of snow or whatever we got on top of it overnight, but it was not meant to last forever. The same is true of this earthly body from that standpoint. It is not meant to last forever. We might take really good care of it. Maybe we're lucky and we have good genes that help us push off some of the ailments that some have to face. We may have good DNA and manage to stay a little bit healthier than the average person. But we're still aging. We're still going to die. The death rate, the mortality rate in this world last year was 100%. Everybody that died. And unless the Lord returns before that happens, we all face that. We're all going to eventually die. That's not being morbid. That's just being factual. Because this body is not designed to last forever. And while we're in this earthly tent, this temporary housing, we're going to groan. We're going to be burdened with life until we're consumed by eternal life. So burdens and suffering and tasks that come along with it, that's just a part of our lives. So what are these things that we all must go through, that we all must do on our own? And these are in no particular order of importance, but they're things that we all must do for ourselves. First off, and that's a dirty word for many, we're to work. No one seems to want to work in this world that we're in, but we're told that we have to work. That is a burden that all of us, if we're physically able, have to bear. There are, which I find so funny, there are anti-work groups. If you look on Facebook, you can find them. They just don't believe anyone should work, that the rich should just take care of everyone, or the government should just support everyone. Well, where's that money coming from? We're told to work. The scriptures would not teach against work. In fact, it would teach the opposite. 2 Thessalonians chapter 3 and beginning in verse 6, if we want to eat, then we must work. How many problems in our society could be instantly removed from if we just read verse 11 and that was followed? I would say many of the issues that we are dealing with right now would be straightened out. If you're able to work, then you do that. Beginning in verse 6 here of 2 Thessalonians chapter 3, but we command you, brethren, in the name of our Lord Jesus Christ, that you withdraw from every brother who walks disorderly and not according to the tradition which he received from us. For you yourselves know how you ought to follow us. For we were not disorderly among you, nor did we eat anyone's bread free of charge, but worked with labor and toil night and day, that we might not be a burden to any of you, not because we do not have authority but to make ourselves an example of how you should follow us. For even when we were with you, we commanded you this, if anyone will not work, neither shall he eat. For we hear that there are some who walk among you in a disorderly manner, not working at all, but are busybodies. They're not working. They're able to work, but they're not. They're running around and they're busybodies. They're getting involved in things that they shouldn't because they have too much free time on their hands. There are plenty of able-bodied people who are capable of working, but they won't because they found a way to mooch off of the system without getting their hands dirty. That's just a sad reality. In this country, there are over 7 million able-bodied men who have removed themselves from the workforce. That's a sad fact. How are they surviving? Somebody's feeding them because we don't see them starving, but they have made themselves that could be working, but they're not. And our government seems to, in some cases, be encouraging this. We want that dependency on the government because then we're loyal subjects to them. But that's psychologically damaging to us for a number of reasons. It's also sinful because working is something that we're commanded to do. We have so many people, though, that have made themselves unemployable. because of decisions that they're made. And then are we supposed to support them? Go back to verse 10. What does that say? If the person is able to work, if they don't eat. Now, we're going to talk about later again how we can help those who can't work, who find themselves in hardships, not because of their unwillingness to work, but because of other problems that have been created in life. There are ways that we can help those, but those who can work, we're not encouraged to work, we're commanded to. Remember, that's what Paul said in verse 6. We command you, brethren, in the name of the Lord Jesus Christ. That's by his authority. We're commanding you this. And that was one of the reasons to withdraw from someone, was because they're not working and supporting themselves. I'm also supposed to provide for my own. It's a burden. It shouldn't be one that we don't want to do. It's my family. I should want to provide for them. But sadly, many don't see the need in that either, in providing for their family. 1 Timothy chapter 5 and verse 8. What does this say about someone and about their character who won't take care of their family? We shouldn't think very highly of them in this society. Well, God thinks very little of them as well. 1 Timothy chapter 5 and verse 8, but if anyone does not provide for his own, and especially for those of his household, he has denied the faith and is worse than an unbeliever. We should look at that as a great insult to that person, to be classed with the heathen, the lowest of the low. An unbeliever doesn't believe in anything, doesn't believe in God. It should be a shame and a reproach on us. In our society, I'm not sure that holds true like it should, but how we should feel if we're able to provide but are unwilling to provide for our family. Not just financially, but there's spiritual work that needs to be done as well. In Galatians chapter 6 and verse 4, this should not be a stretch to use this for both spiritual and physical work that needs to be done. There are things that we are to do ourselves, and when we do them, we can look on them with satisfaction that we have completed the jobs that needed to be done. Galatians 6 and verse 4, but let each one examine his own work, and then he will have rejoicing in himself alone and not in another. I didn't need to have someone else take care of the work that was my responsibility to do. I did it my own. Isn't Proverbs filled with passages that speaks of the working man or woman and how sweet their rest is when they have done this work? And how many verses talk about the despair of the slothful and the lazy and the one that is unwilling to work? Again, our society doesn't necessarily like this fact, but there's work that needs to be done in the church, especially. Not just physically, but spiritually. In Mark chapter 13 and verse 34, the house here represents the church. Jesus ascended into heaven and left the church with us. His kingdom is here for us. We each have our work to do in the church. We had a lesson a few weeks ago about the laborers being few and lots of jobs to be done. Well, we can shirk our duty and our responsibility, and someone else may very well come in and pick up and fill that slack that is left. But that's not an excuse for me to leave my responsibility. In Mark chapter 13 and verse 34, it is like a man going to a far country who left his house and gave authority to his servants and to each his work and commanded the doorkeeper to watch. That's not only referring to taking part in the public worship. That's part of it, but there are many more responsibilities that I should be doing. As Jesus said, the fields are ripe. The harvest is plentiful, but there are few that are going to go out and work in those fields. There are many other areas of work that we could look at, but we see that there's work that needs to be done. But there are those who can't work, that we do need to help and fulfill Galatians chapter 6 and verse 2 in that. There are those who can't. We know that. Common sense needs to be applied. But just because a person is unwilling to work does not mean that that then places the burden upon me. I can speak directly to this because I know if you want to see some that I'm referring to, I can take you on a little tour downtown on any given day. And there are people that I've been told that from people that know who draw thousands of dollars a month. They don't spend that money on necessities like housing and food. They spend it on alcohol and drugs. And then there's professional panhandlers that come around and want me to give them money. Is that, and many would say, oh yes, that's your responsibility as a Christian to give them money because they're in need. Well, why are they in need? They're in need because they have been making horrible decisions. Is that a Christian's responsibility to support them in that? Remember what Paul said, if you don't work, you don't eat. That they're living sinful lifestyles and have the resources to not be in need, but they're choosing to be that way because of the addiction. And that could go back to mental health issues and many other problems, but us just doling out money may not be the right answer for that. Another burden that we have to go through, and sadly many of our congregation are dealing with this. My mom would be one of them. Physical pain and suffering. There are things that our bodies, for whatever reason, have happened to them, and it's only our bodies. It's no one else can take that from us. I had surgery back in 2021. I was in very serious pain before that. And I was in very serious pain after the surgery. And a number of times my mom and dad would say, oh, we wish we could take that away from you. I'm sure they would have if they could have. I wouldn't have wanted to give that to my worst enemy. I'm sure Jenny would have taken that pain away from me because I was a big pain in her neck. She would have taken it away just so she wouldn't have to suffer because of me being so grumpy. No, I was a ray of sunshine all the time. But she couldn't, it was inside of me. There was nothing that could be done. That was suffering that I had to bear on my own. But if we have a loved one that's in pain and suffering, wouldn't we want to take that away from them if we could? But we can't. Being a Christian does not exclude you from physical ailments. Look at Paul. He had a thorn in the flesh. 2 Corinthians chapter 12 and beginning in verse 7, many have created theories as to what this thorn was and what this problem was. But we're not told other than right here when he says, I ask God to remove it and take it from me. In 2 Corinthians chapter 12 and in verse 7, it says, and lest I should be exalted above measure by the abundance of the revelations, a thorn in the flesh was given to me, a messenger of Satan to buffet me, lest I be exalted above measure. Concerning this thing, I pleaded with the Lord 3 times that it might depart from me. And he said to me, my grace is sufficient for you, for my strength is made perfect in weakness. Therefore, most gladly, I will rather boast in my infirmities, that the power of Christ may rest upon me. Therefore, I take pleasure in infirmities, in reproaches, in needs, in persecutions, in distress, for Christ's sake. For when I am weak, I am strong. But whatever it was caused Paul pain and distress, this discomfort, this thorn in your flesh. It hurts when we get something, a splinter or something in our hand. I mean, all of our attention goes to that. And whatever this was causing Paul enough pain. He went to God 3 separate times and asked for comfort to remove this. But his answer was no. And Paul says, I've been given this to remind me and to keep me humble, lest I get exalted too much. And the Hebrew custom was to attribute this severe pain and disease to Satan. And Paul is saying, Satan has brought this to me. Well, Satan is the ruler of this world, of the sinful elements of this world, that and pain would be mixed in there. So that would be true, wouldn't it? Anything that is negative was brought about by Satan. And this would be a temptation for Paul because it caused him pain and suffering. And Satan has brought this to me. But no one could endure that pain for Paul. Now, because of this Galatians chapter 4 and verse 5, many have said that the problem was his eyesight. We really don't know that. This could have been a figure of speech or anything else. Or maybe Paul had a problem with his eyesight too, and that wasn't the pain. But in Galatians chapter 4 and verse 15, Paul said, you would have helped. You would have given me your very eyes if you could have. But they couldn't do that. Galatians chapter 4 and verse 15, what then was the blessing you enjoyed? For I bear witness, for I bear you witness that, if possible, you would have plucked out your own eyes and given them to me. I'm sure that in some way each of us is, if I could just give this help to someone, if I could take that pain in me and let them have some time of peace, I would do that for them. But we can't do that. It's something that we each have to bear on our own. And just because I'm a Christian does not remove that potential burden from me. Now, again, we can do things that may or may not. Some are just unfortunate with the genes that they have been given. Some people experience more pain. Some have injuries that cause long-term pain. There are just different reasons why we do that. But once it's inside me, it's inside me. There's nothing that I can do. That doesn't mean that I, as some would try to say, well, sin must have brought that to you. No, the scriptures don't teach that. Or if you were living right, some people will say that if you were living right, then you wouldn't have this problem. Again, no, that's not always the case. I mean, sometimes it might be, but no, that's not always the case. Sometimes it's just something that we have to bear and go through. But the good news is that if we are Christians and we are living a life that's pleasing in God's sight, then that suffering and pain that we're enduring while we're on this earth will be done away with. When we die and leave this earth, all of those things will be forgotten if we have obeyed the gospel. And if we have lived faithful, then all of the trials and struggles and tribulations of this world will not even be a memory. We will have no memory of them. All those things will be done away with. So if you're subject to the Lord's invitation in any way, take this time to think about the condition of your soul and make changes while we have the opportunity as we stand and sing.